Good morning and welcome to Love Every Moment, coming to you today from Oshkosh, Wisconsin. And remember, what happens in Oshkosh stays in Oshkosh. Just kidding. Now, today's verse is 1 Peter 1:11, seeking to know what person or time the Spirit of Christ within them was indicating as he predicted the sufferings of Christ and the glories to follow. Well, naturally, this week's verse comes after last week's verse, and I have the link up here, which had talked about the struggles that the prophets who were writing about the Christ, the struggles they had to really figure out, gee, what's going on here? This week, we're getting more specifics on that, seeking to know what person or time we're talking about, and about the sufferings and the glories to come. So this is the struggle that the prophets were having. Why don't we look at one of those prophets, Isaiah, and see what he had to deal with as he wrote about these things. Let's start in Isaiah chapter 9, verse 6. Very familiar verse. For a child will be born to us, a son will be given to us, and the government will rest on his shoulders. And his name will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Eternal Father, Prince of Peace. There will be no end to the increase of his government or of peace on the throne of David and over his kingdom, to establish it and to uphold it with justice and righteousness from then on and forevermore. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will accomplish this. Well, this is a wonderful portion of the glory of Christ, and I'm sure that Isaiah and probably the readers of Isaiah assumed that we were talking about a human government here. Of course, we now know that Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world," but it appears to be a glorious reigning in a human government setting. But this is in chapter 9. Now further, in chapter 53, we get a completely different picture. And let's start at verse 3, and I'll pull out just a couple of other things. He was despised and forsaken of men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief, and like one from whom men hide their face, he was despised, and we did not esteem him. And part of verse 5 says, but he was pierced through for our transgressions. And part of verse 7 says, like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, he kept silent, and so on. So this is predicting the terrible sufferings and the death of Christ. So Isaiah must have been thinking, and the readers of Isaiah must have been thinking, what's going on? We just had him reigning over the government, and now he's suffering a terrible death. Well, of course, this is the part that Isaiah wasn't privy to, or the readers of Isaiah, but we are. We know it's actually backwards, that the suffering comes first and then the glory is later. Now, another one. Let's have a look at this one. Psalm 22, which starts off with a very famous, my God, why have you forsaken me? And it goes on to again detail the sufferings of Jesus on the cross. But the part I'm going to pull out is interesting. It's the last verse. And to really make it hit, I'm going to read the Message version of it. Verse 31 says, babies not yet conceived will hear the good news that God does what he says. And what I'm saying on this is there's going to be a generation to come that's really going to get this message. We may not get the full portion now, but generations to come will. Now, finally, I know we've been jumping around, but let's look at Matthew 13, starting with verse 10. Matthew had just talked about the parable of the sower and the seeds, and the disciples came and said to him, why do you speak to them in parables? Jesus answered them, to you it has been granted to know the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it has not been granted. And jumping down to verse 16, but blessed are your eyes because they see, and your ears because they hear. It's wonderful to look in the Old Testament and find Jesus. It's like a game of hide and seek. And, ooh, I found Jesus right there. And, ooh, there he is again. And Jesus smiles and says to me, yep, you found me. And that's the glory of the New Testament age that we're privy to. So let's choose to love him every moment, because then we're going to love him every moment. I'm your average wretch, and I hope you have a great week.